Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. Today in Dave's Garage, a computer guy with a lot of cars and tools is going to talk about issues related to autism. In today's episode, are Vulcans autistic? Specifically, was the character of Spock conceived of as autistic?
He's a Vulcan. You can't force emotion out of him. Destroy him.
Yes, well, everyone knows that much. But what does it mean? Does it mean that Vulcans are autistic? Short answer, yes, with an if. Long answer, no, with a but. I'm actually going to argue two things. First, that Vulcans most likely were in fact inspired by autism. And the second is that a human, and not a Vulcan, was actually the first autistic character to appear on Star Trek. But more on that later, because first we must attend to the 800-pound gorilla on the white elephant in the center of the room, and that is the fact that Spock is an alien. And fictional. While Kirk is the ostensible hero of the show, I believe that for many fans, and I think this is especially true for any fans who find themselves on the spectrum, it is the character of Spock who resonates the most strongly and for whom they feel the most kinship. I was born during the original television run of Star Trek, but was too young to watch it until it was in syndication on Saturday mornings. When I did watch, I was as eager as anyone else for Kirk to save the day, just as soon as Spock figured out how it could be done. I think a lot of people with Aspergers and Autism look up to Spock, not because he's a paragon of logic or because he's devoid of emotion, but precisely because he has learned to control and master his emotions, most of the time. And now, as a bit of a tangential aside, it may not surprise you to learn that people with Asperger's often love to take you on tangential asides. So let's push Spock on the stack just momentarily and talk about similes and metaphors briefly. If you're anything like me, you have the sometimes inconvenient habit of taking similes and metaphors literally, or at least visually. When I made the earlier reference to the gorilla and the white elephant, did you actually picture the gorilla on top of the white elephant? Or did you know they were both just metaphorical, and so their relative position didn't matter? They're just a literary device for conveying the notion of something inconvenient and obvious. But if you're on the spectrum, you might take such things literally. When I hear white elephant, I actually picture a specific white elephant from an old cartoon, likely the first and only actual white elephant that I've seen. When I was a wee lad, my grandfather was visiting from out of town, and he happened to be building my mother a little shelf in the kitchen on which she could place the pot for a creeping ivy plant. He seriously overbuilt the shelf with two huge middle brackets, but I was still a toddler, so I asked him if it would be strong enough to hold the plant. He replied confidently that it would be strong enough to hold a horse. I remember being startled by the visual of the horse up in the air on the planter's shelf, and the next conundrum was, how would you get a horse into the kitchen? And why would anybody do such a thing in the first place? Who has such a need? If your brain does indeed work similar to mine at all, you've perhaps had a similar moment, and I'd love to hear about it. Please consider sharing it in the comments section below if you recall such a time in your own young life. I'm curious as to what similes and metaphors you found yourself instinctively picturing in your mind. Okay, back to Spock, who we last noted could not have had Asperger's or autism, because he is, of course, fictional, and an alien. When Star Trek was conceived by Gene Roddenberry back in the 1960s, autism was still largely unknown to the general public. When it was noted in medical literature, it was often labeled as infantile schizophrenia and blamed on quote-unquote refrigerator mothers who supposedly did not love their babies enough at the right time. It was a dark time to be on the spectrum, and perhaps an even darker time to be the mother of a baby on the spectrum. And so, let me be clear. When I say Spock was autistic, what I'm actually saying is that the character of Spock, and hence of Vulcans in general, was almost certainly inspired by someone with autism. More specifically, I believe that someone Roddenberry knew must have had what would until very recently been known as Asperger syndrome. And based on the way that Vulcans are portrayed in the series, he presumably greatly admired and respected whoever that was, as Vulcans tend to be by far the most capable and virtuous individuals on the show. They are smarter, stronger, wiser, and more peaceful than their human counterparts. In fact, their only reason for hanging around with humans seems to be the thrill of becoming wrapped up in one of their wild, neurotypical adventures. Yeehaw. Gene Roddenberry died in 1991, and so far as I can tell, no one thought to directly ask him if there had been any one specific person upon whom he based the Vulcan persona. Some have speculated that it might have been LAPD Chief Willie Parker, but lacking any kind of possible authoritative answer, the best we can likely do is to look for similarities between the attributes that he conceived for his Vulcan characters and the traits and characteristics of people on the autism spectrum. If it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, or so the saying goes, it's probably a duck. So let's see how similar they really are and if they at least both quack. But if we do that, what does that mean about what I think of autism? Am I saying that, like Vulcans, people with autism have no emotions? But that's a trick question, because Vulcans do have emotions. very strong emotions, deep emotions that from time to time we see them struggle with immensely. They even lose control of their emotions in rare instances. If you've only watched the show casually, you might have thought that Vulcans simply did not evolve emotions at all. We ultimately learn, however, that the Vulcans were deeply emotional people, but it kept coming back to bite them. When you're as strong, wise, and peaceful as a Vulcan, you can't risk an emotional outburst or decision scuttling your strong, wise, and peaceful plans. And so the Vulcan people decided to control and suppress their emotions, keeping them entirely internal. Over the eons, they even lost the ability to communicate emotionally as well, leaving them only with cold, calculating logic. Even though it is often described and portrayed as such, logical thought is not the opposite of emotional thought. It is simply that which is left when you take rational thought and remove the emotion. Logic should be what you have underneath, girding your emotions, not instead of them. You should always have a logical foundation on which to rest your emotional arguments. If you build your logical argument on top of emotional foundations, it may convince initially, but it will not stand the test of time. And so it is with autism as well, emotion and logic competing for precedence. We shall dedicate an entire upcoming episode to that topic of emotions and autism, and how and whether people with autism even have emotions. Please remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the emotions episode when it's released. But here's a spoiler. Autistic people do indeed have emotions. They lead deep, rich, emotional lives, internally. Imagine, perhaps, that there is a missing or somehow restricted connection from the emotional part of the brain to the brain's social and communication circuits. And that's a very different thing from the emotional part being absent. In Star Trek mythology, the Vulcans were a highly emotional people, but, as noted, it kept getting them into trouble, with negative emotions like paranoia and rage commonplace in their society until a philosopher by the name of Surak developed his code of emotional control. So Vulcans are internally emotional, but they do not communicate it through their speech, facial expressions, and general affect. We also need to remember that Vulcans are able to communicate telepathically with other Vulcans, so we can assume they can perhaps communicate emotions through that back channel. When it comes to communicating with humans, however, they're left with only standard communication channels, and so there's a disconnect. When time and circumstances permit, Vulcans can mind meld and transfer thoughts and emotions with a human, or a lump of molten rock monster, but it's a complicated and sometimes painful process, not unlike couples counseling, perhaps. Further evidence of a rich emotional internal life comes in the episode Naked Time, which aired on CBS television way back on September 29, 1966. In this episode, we are given a glimpse of what Spock worries about, such as his mother's experience as a young bride in a mixed marriage on a lonely planet. He begins to cry, and being the 1960s, Captain Kirk provides state-of-the-art mental health support by slapping him until he quits it. Works every time, on television.
I could never tell her I loved her. Living on a planet where love, emotion, bad taste. Jim.
And yet, for all the evidence, Vulcans are dogged by the notion that because they keep their emotions in internal check and do not communicate them openly, they must not even have them. But, like many people with autism, those rich emotional lives can sometimes boil over and become overwhelming. And when they do, something known as a meltdown can result. Not to be confused with a tantrum or a panic attack. A meltdown occurs when an individual with autism has exceeded their capacity to deal with the amount of external stimulus and internal emotional turmoil that they're currently experiencing. The typical solution is to retreat to their own private room or some other safe space and to remove sounds and other stimuli until emotional control returns. But that doesn't sound very Vulcan at all. And yet, if you dig deep enough into the Star Trek archives, you will indeed find Spock having a meltdown. He walks back to his quarters in inconsolable tears, trying desperately to remind himself that he is an officer, subject to certain standards of conduct, and that he is in control.
I'm in control of my emotions. Control of my emotions. I am an officer.
In that failed attempt at simply willing himself to be suddenly better, he repeatedly commands himself, "I am in control of my emotions," in the hopes of making it true. Alas, he is unable to regain control, but is driven onward by a sense of military duty. He finally resorts to counting by twos to regain some semblance of control. This approach is similar to a meditation, perhaps, to center himself around the logic he holds so dear. He uses it as a handhold to steady himself against a storm of emotion. But will it be enough?
I'm sorry. 2, 4, 6. 6 times. 6.
And so, there you have it. A highly intelligent loner that doesn't suffer fools gladly, who dwells in the details to the exclusion of the big picture. He is racked with emotions internally that he cannot effectively express to others, to the point that he has periodic breakdowns when he doesn't manage the stress well. Still not convinced? When a person with autism experiences a meltdown, it can be problematic and inconvenient, let's say, for the neurotypical partners involved. Spock noted that it is very little different for Vulcans.
However, I have noted that the healthy release of emotion is frequently very unhealthy for those closest to you.
Once we know that emotions are indeed present internally, we can ask whether a Vulcan can understand the emotions of another person, in particular, a neurotypical human. And indeed, just as in the case of emotion, we find that empathy is indeed impaired by communication. The Vulcan, like a person with autism, is often oblivious to the emotional plight of a neurotypical human. But they do deeply care, and if they can be made to understand the other person's predicament, it is as moving and important to them as it is to anyone else. Parents of children with autism can sometimes wonder how their child can love them back if they lack an apparent sense of empathy. I will table all of that until the episode dedicated entirely to empathy, other than for now to note the sometimes touching relationship between Dr. McCoy and Mr. Spock. You might think it purely comic relief in the original series before later becoming a serious bromance in the movies, but I'd like you to consider the following scene from the episode with the rather heady title of "For the World is Hollow, and I Have Touched the Sky." Oh, sorry. For context, Dr. McCoy is believed to be dying, but they haven't told the autistic kid, or that is to say, Mr. Spock. And so here I give you Captain Kirk telling little Timmy the bad news. You'll be able to see the obvious emotional impact on Spock, for even though he receives the news without changing facial expressions, he is obviously quite moved.
May I ask precisely what is troubling the doctor?
It's xenopolycythemia.
I know of it, Captain.
Then you know that nothing can be done.
I'm all right. Are you all right, Mr. Spock?
Very well, Doctor. The captain and I seem to have suffered no ill effects.
Oh, that oracle really got to me. I must be especially susceptible to its magic spells.
Spock knows.
Spock clearly demonstrates strong empathy for his friend once he understands the emotional payload of the situation. He is quite obviously very sad for his friend. He grabs and holds his shoulder for mutual reassurance, and yet his countenance, or his facial expression, remains entirely fixed. He doesn't blink, even in the face of tragedy, and yet that does not mean that he does not feel it. The parallels with the emotional response on people with autism seem clear. On the lighter side, over and over we see Spock being every bit as literal as the most Aspergian among us. I'll provide only a single example, but it was almost a weekly shtick. It's hard to separate how much is homage to the literal interpretations so common to people with autism and how much is just 1960s fish-out-of-water comedy. I think it's a safe bet that it's a bit of both.
Mr. Spock, are you all right?
Yes, I believe no permanent damage was done.
What happened?
The occipital area of my head seems to have impacted with the arm of the chair.
No, Mr. Spock. I meant, what happened to us?
If the Vulcan serves as the intergalactic proxy for the individual with autism, what of teasing and bullying? Kirk seems largely above it and esteems his friend enough to only prod at their differences in those instances when perhaps Mr. Spock is being a bit too oblivious and could perhaps benefit from the clues. Dr. McCoy, however, initially makes frequent and unkind sport of his alien nature. While the show is generally regarded as being progressive on social issues, I was still surprised that the series was already attempting to call attention to the xenophobia that Spock experiences for being different, particularly from Dr. McCoy. While the two characters would build a close relationship over the subsequent decades, it began with the Doctor being highly discriminatory towards the Vulcan for those differences. It's only when Spock stands up to the human that he gains his respect and sets the stage for the friendship that ultimately follows. Here is that little remembered but vital scene.
Now you listen to me, you pointed-eared Vulcan. I don't like that. I don't think I ever did, and now I'm sure.
What's happening to you, Spock?
Nothing that shouldn't have happened long ago.
From that point forward, they seem to have a mutual understanding that McCoy can jest with Spock about his heritage only when Spock allows it and within certain respectful limits. McCoy's frequent barbs become a much more playful banter, one that Spock occasionally even gets the best of. If, however, I'm going to be in any way objective about this, then I must confess that Spock was not technically the first possibly autistic character on Star Trek. In fact, it wasn't even a Vulcan. It was a character of the second in command of the Enterprise as performed by Majel Hudek, who you might know better as Nurse Chapel, or as the voice of the Enterprise computer, or later as Gene Roddenberry's wife. Referred to as number one in the very original first pilot, she was every bit as intellectual and yet just as repressed emotionally as Spock, yet human. Those initial overtures towards Asperger's in that first pilot were not fully consummated until the arrival of Spock in the first episode of the regular series. From there forward, it was clear that the role was going to be Aspergian regardless of the race. That it became an alien eventually made it easier for the writers, perhaps, to fulfill Roddenberry's complete vision for the character. I've found that just as I managed to finally convince someone that Spock was clearly modeled after a brilliant person with Asperger's who was probably in the military, things can then go too far. Not only will they grant that Vulcans are autistic, they're quick to offer, "Ooh, and so was Data on Star Trek The Next Generation." Yeah, let's not get carried away. Data's a robot, and he's not autistic. He's what Vulcans might have been if they were just a pile of cliches and not drawn from a rich personal human experience. He does not have a rich inner emotional life. If he has any emotions, they're largely limited to pining on about wishing to be human. He's a caricature of the supporting cast from Wizard of Oz, all rolled into one, and not much more. The highlight of his existence among his fans seems to have been as a piece of fully functional exercise equipment for the blonde head of security. How lovely. Dare to dream. It would be an insult to people with autism to equate their condition with someone who had sex one time and then spent the rest of their life wishing they were fully human. Well, most of them would be insulted anyway. So then let's have no more talk of robots and autism. Not on my watch. Because Vulcans, now they are a proud race. They are a people that carry a great internal burden and do so without flinching under the load or complaining. A dignified race of often highly intelligent beings that do not aspire to be precisely like everyone else in the Federation. Unlike the hive mind that drives some of the collective alien races, Vulcans wish neither to absorb nor assimilate, but largely to be left alone to pursue that which is meaningful to them with the least harassment. They make an excellent ally, and they tend to make friends with one or two very close friends rather than with a wide assortment of acquaintances. They form very few shallow relationships and but one or two true friendships. Like a marriage, perhaps, there's not room for another Kirk or another Spock. It is a true partnership where each completes the other, covers for their weaknesses and deficiencies, and complements their strengths. If you are fortunate enough to earn a Vulcan's trust and befriend one over time, you will find them to be exceptionally loyal. They generally operate by a strict code of honor from which it pains them to deviate, and they are almost entirely incapable of deceit or fabrication. You will have made a friend for life. Too bad they're fictional. Please join me next time here in Dave's Garage, where we'll continue our autism series and future episodes on topics such as empathy, emotions, masking, mind blindness, relationships, marriage, parenting, employment, and many, many more. But this is a tiny, tiny channel, which means that to see those episodes, you'll need to subscribe. So please do so before you forget. And you know how the old ADD symptoms typically accompany autism, so make sure you'll remember. Maybe I should wait? No, I trust you to remember. But I do have a favor to ask. It's a fairly common sentiment that Mr. Spock is one of the most beloved characters amongst people with Asperger's and autism. So if you know any Star Trek fans, especially someone on the spectrum that you think might enjoy this video, please share it or send them a link, or post this to your Facebook wall, or tweet it at people, or post a picture of me on Snapchat, or draw it in lipstick on a sexy part of your body and then mail that around. No, don't bother. Follow the acceptable use policies of your social networks. And it's one of those things that if you don't do it, Who's going to do it? That's the way life works. So that's why I'm asking you. Thank you very much. Until next time in Dave's Garage, stay safe and stay sane. Thanks for watching. Gene Roddenberry died in 1991. Oh yeah, I should laugh about that. Too soon, Dave. Gene Roddenberry died in... Stop it. Sorry, Gene. I was born in 1968, which in most other regards was a rough year for America. North Korea took us hostage. The Tet Offensive took us by surprise. MLK and RFK's lives were taken violently. Cities burned, and campuses around the world shook from student protest. Yet, if for some reason the real world was uninviting, in the universe that Gene Roddenberry created, every little kid could find a hero. Not only were women and minorities included in the cast, this time they occupied positions of authority and responsibility. Uhura was not a sassy waitress in a diner, she was a highly specialized and serious communications officer. In Sulu's chest beat the heart of a swashbuckling swordsman. Suddenly, at the height of the Cold War, even a Russian kid with a stiff accent could find a touch point. The neurotypical nerds had their Scotty, but what of those on the spectrum? Though I did not even know it at the time, I'm sure that I took great satisfaction and comfort in seeing the logic and reason that Spock and I both held so dear respected instead of being mocked, his intellect and reserved nature valued, not demeaned. I knew that eventually there would come a time and a place where I too would fit in, and that has made all the difference. So thank you, Mr. Roddenberry.